The fork
This way,
trembled in
please.
her
Watch your
hand.
step.
Thank you,
Not from
Sergeant.
the cold, though Wisconsin winter bit hard through the mess hall walls. Not from weakness, though 8 months as a prisoner had hollowed her out in ways no mirror could show. The fork
This is
trembled because
delicious.
Margareta
Yes, very
Schneider,
good.
28
I'm
years
glad you
old,
like
trained
it.
Army nurse, loyal daughter of the Third Reich,
Thank you.
was about
You're
to
welcome.
taste something that would shatter every truth she'd ever been taught. The plate sat before her, white ceramic clean enough to catch the pale morning light streaming through frost-covered windows. On that plate lay 4 strips of bacon, thick-cut American bacon, each piece glistening with rendered fat edges crisped to a perfect bronze. Steam rose from scrambled eggs, yellow and fluffy, cooked in real butter. 2 slices of toast, golden brown with a thumb-sized pat of butter melting into the grain. A mug of coffee, so strong its bitter aroma cut through every other smell in the room. Greta stared at this plate. Around her, 51 other German women prisoners sat frozen at long wooden tables, their own plates cooling in front of them. The only sounds were the distant clatter of American cooks in the kitchen, the creak of the building settling in the cold, and the soft, desperate breathing of women who hadn't seen this much food in half a year. January 17, 1945. Fort McCoy, Wisconsin. 6:47 in the morning. She picked up a bacon strip with her fork. The meat was still hot enough to burn if she moved too fast. The smell hit her fully now. Salt, smoke, fat, real pork seasoned and cooked with care. Not the scraps Nazi officers had told them Americans fed to dogs. Not spoiled or rotted or mixed with sawdust to stretch the rations. This was bacon the way bacon ought to be. Perfect, abundant, impossible. Greta brought the fork to her lips. Her grip wavered. Beside her, Elizabeth Hoffman watched with dark, knowing eyes. Across the table, Katharina Weber clutched her rosary beads beneath the table and prayed silently in Bavarian dialect. The bite entered Greta's mouth. Salt exploded across her tongue first. Then came the smoke flavor, deep and wood-fired like autumn back home when Father used to cure meat in the old smokehouse. Then the fat, rich and coating, filling her mouth with a taste her body had almost forgotten existed. She chewed slowly. The bacon was crispy on the edges, but still tender in the middle. Perfectly cooked. Perfectly seasoned. Perfect. Her vision blurred as emotion overwhelmed her control. This wasn't prison food. This wasn't punishment. This wasn't even mercy. This was just breakfast. The same breakfast American soldiers were eating 30 feet away at their own tables. The same breakfast free men ate, and the Americans were giving it to their enemies, which meant everything had been a lie. Every single word. Greta Schneider swallowed that bite of bacon, and with it she swallowed the complete destruction of her worldview. She reached for the eggs. She ate them. They tasted impossibly good. She picked up the toast. Real butter, not margarine, melting into warm bread. She drank the coffee. It was strong enough to make her eyes water, but it was real coffee, not the chicory substitute Germans had been drinking for 3 years. Her shoulders began to shake, not from cold, from the terrible, liberating understanding that crashed through her mind like artillery fire. They lied to us. About everything. About who the Americans were. About what they would do. About what they believed. About everything. Freeze that moment. Hold it. Because in that instant, 3 German women began a journey that would change not just their lives, but help reshape an entire nation. Let's go back 48 hours to understand how they arrived at that breakfast table, to understand what they expected to find, and to understand why the taste of American bacon destroyed them more completely than any bomb ever could. The train car stank of fear and unwashed bodies. 52 German women packed into space meant for cargo, not people. The floor was hard wood splattered with old stains nobody wanted to think about too carefully. No seats, no heat, just bodies pressed together for warmth as the train rattled west across America through landscapes none of them had names for. They'd been captured in North Africa, some in December of 1944, some earlier. Radio operators, nurses, clerical staff, supply coordinators. Not combat troops, but they'd worn the uniform. They'd served the Reich. And now America owned them. The women tried to sleep sitting up, leaning against each other, sharing thin blankets that did little against the January cold. Outside, snow covered everything. Endless white fields, forests of bare trees, small towns that appeared and vanished like ghosts. America looked clean. That was the first thing that struck them. Clean and untouched, while Europe burned and bled and starved. In one corner of that cattle car sat three women who would become inseparable, not by choice at first, but by the strange mathematics of suffering that pushes strangers together. Margaret Schneider. Everyone called her Greta. 28 years old, tall and blonde, in the way propaganda posters celebrated. Before the war, before nursing school, before everything, she'd been a girl from Munich who loved reading and wanted to teach literature. But Hitler Youth had taught her duty came before dreams. The Wehrmacht had taught her how to set broken bones and amputate limbs without anesthetic. Capture had taught her that losing didn't mean dying, at least not right away. She sat with her back straight against the train car wall, even though exhaustion made her bones ache. Discipline. That's what kept people alive. Discipline and order, and refusing to let fear win. Her blonde hair, once kept in perfect military regulation, now hung limp and dirty past her shoulders. She'd lost weight. They all had. But Greta still held herself like a soldier. Her hands, when they weren't shaking from cold, were steady. Nurses' hands, hands that had held countless men as they died. Around her neck, hidden under her worn shirt, hung an iron cross pendant her father had given her before the bombing killed him. She touched it sometimes, seeking comfort in cold metal, seeking some connection to the Germany she remembered. The Germany before the war destroyed everything. Next to Greta sat Elizabeth Hoffman, 24 years old, small and dark-haired, with eyes that missed nothing. Where Greta had believed, Elise had questioned. Her father had been a professor at the University of Berlin, philosophy and political theory. He taught his daughter to think critically, to ask difficult questions, to never accept easy answers. The Gestapo had arrested him in 1942 for speaking against the regime to his students. They called it sedition. He called it truth. Elise never saw him again. She'd been drafted into communications work, radio operation, message routing, signal processing. Smart girls got technical jobs. The Wehrmacht needed her brain, not her belief. She'd gone through the motions, done her work, kept her head down and her mouth shut. But inside, she'd been collecting evidence, watching, waiting, knowing that eventually the lies would collapse under their own weight. Now on this freezing train rolling through America, she sat with a small notebook sewn into the lining of her coat. Pages of observations written in a code her father had taught her. She'd been documenting everything since capture. What the Americans did, what they said, how they treated prisoners. She wrote because her father had taught her that truth mattered even when truth couldn't save you. Across from both of them huddled Katharina Weber. Everyone called her Kat. 22 years old, with a round face and auburn hair that curled when it wasn't forced flat by military regulation. She looked younger than her years, still had that farm girl softness that military life hadn't fully erased. She'd grown up in Bavaria, in a small village where everyone knew everyone, and life moved with the seasons. Plant in spring, harvest in fall, pray on Sunday, simple, good. The war had taken her anyway. Clerical work in North Africa, filing reports, typing orders, organizing supply manifests, boring work, safe work, until it wasn't. Until the Allies rolled through and suddenly safe jobs became prisoner of war status. Kat had cried the first 3 days after capture. She'd prayed constantly, rosary beads clicking through her fingers like a heartbeat. Her parents were still alive back in Bavaria, as far as she knew. They'd written before communication stopped. Father worried about the harvest. Mother worried about everything. Both of them told her to be brave, be good, come home safe. She was trying. God, she was trying. The train began to slow. Women stirred from uneasy half-sleep. Outside, through gaps in the car's wooden walls, they could see buildings. Guard towers, fences, barbed wire stretching into white distance. They'd arrived. Fort McCoy, Wisconsin, a prisoner of war camp in the middle of America's frozen heartland. This would be their home for as long as the Americans decided to keep them. The train screeched to a halt. Metal groaned. Steam hissed from the engine like a dying animal. Silence fell inside the cattle car. 52 women holding their breath, waiting to see what happened next. What they expected was violence. They'd been told, warned, threatened with stories. American camps were brutal. Prisoners starved. Guards beat people for sport. Women faced worse than death. These warnings had echoed through every German military unit, whispered from soldier to soldier, like ghost stories designed to prevent surrender. Better to die fighting than fall into American hands. That's what the officers said. That's what everyone believed. Greta adjusted her worn uniform jacket and stood up straight. If they were going to kill her, she'd die with dignity. Elizabeth checked the notebook hidden in her coat lining one more time, making sure her father's teachings were secure. Katerina gripped her rosary so hard the wooden beads left marks in her palm. The train door slid open with a grinding screech. Cold air rushed in. Wisconsin a winter sharp enough to steal breath. Snow covered everything outside, pristine and white, almost beautiful if you could ignore the context. Guard towers rose against gray sky. Fences stretched in geometric precision. American flags snapped in the wind. And then they saw the guards. American soldiers, young men in clean uniforms holding rifles but not pointing them, standing at ease, not shouting, not advancing with clubs or dogs, just standing there waiting. One soldier stepped forward, older than the others, maybe early 30s, sergeant stripes on his sleeve. He looked at the women in the train car with an expression that confused them completely. Not hatred, not cruelty, something almost like sympathy. He spoke in English first, then waited while a translator, an older woman with kind eyes, repeated his words in German. Welcome to Fort McCoy. You'll be processed, assigned in quarters, and fed. We follow the Geneva Convention here. You will be treated with dignity and respect. Nobody will harm you. Silence. The women stared at him like he'd spoken in ancient Greek, dignity, respect. This had to be a trick, some kind of psychological torture. Make them feel safe before the real punishment began. Please exit the train car in an orderly fashion, the translator continued. There are trucks waiting to take you to the processing center. Move slowly. It's icy outside. He was worried they might slip. The enemy was worried about them slipping on ice. Greta was the first to move. Someone had to lead. That's what nurses did. They went first into the horrible things so others could follow. She climbed down from the train car, boots crunching into fresh snow. The cold bit through her thin uniform immediately. She stood straight, chin up, waiting. Elizabeth followed, then Katerina, then the rest, one by one, 52 German women stepping out into American winter. They were counted, not roughly, not carelessly, but methodically. Names written down in neat ledgers, medical conditions noted, no shoving, no violence. American efficiency, calm and organized as assembly line. Trucks waited nearby, canvas-covered transport vehicles with benches inside. The women were directed toward them in groups. Still no shouting, still no brutality, just quiet orders and helpful hands when someone stumbled. Greta found herself in a truck with Elizabeth and Katerina. The benches were wooden but clean. The canvas kept out most of the wind. As more women climbed in the truck, filled with body heat, not warm, but warmer than the train had been. An older German woman, maybe 42, sat near the front. Her face was hard, jaw set in permanent anger. This was Helga Richter. She'd worked in Berlin before capture, administrative work, she'd told people. She didn't mention she'd been a secretary in Gestapo headquarters typing orders she tried not to think about too carefully. Helga looked at the younger women and spoke in harsh German. Don't trust this, any of this. Americans lie. They make you comfortable before they destroy you. Stay alert. Remember who you are. Remember who they are. Elizabeth met her eyes and said nothing. But something in Elise's expression made Helga look away first. The truck engine started. They began moving through the camp. Through the canvas opening, the women caught glimpses of Fort McCoy, buildings in neat rows, roads cleared of snow, more American flags, soldiers walking casually, some laughing together like they weren't surrounded by enemies. It looked normal, orderly, almost peaceful, which made it more terrifying than any torture chamber. The truck stopped at a long wooden building, more neat architecture, smoke rising from a chimney. The women were guided inside for processing. Medical examination station, forms to fill out, personal items cataloged. The Americans wrote everything down in duplicate. A female nurse conducted the medical checks. American, maybe late 20s with kind eyes and efficient movements. She spoke some German, learned from her grandmother, she explained, in accented but understandable words. Her name was Sarah Mitchell. She worked at the camp hospital. She examined each woman with gentle professionalism. When she got to Greta, she paused. Notice the old shrapnel scar on Greta's shoulder, partially healed but infected. Sarah cleaned it properly, applied real sulfa powder, bandaged it with clean gauze. The kind of care you'd give a friend, not an enemy. "You're a nurse too, yes?" Sarah asked in German. "I can tell by the way you hold still. You understand medical treatment." Greta nodded, not trusting her voice. "The infection should clear up now. Keep the bandage dry. I'll check it in 3 days." Sarah smiled, genuinely, like Greta was a patient, not a prisoner. When Katerina's turn came, Kat couldn't stop shaking. Sarah noticed, gave her a little extra time, spoke softly, showed Kat a photo of her own family's farm in Wisconsin. Rolling hills, dairy cows, apple trees. It looked almost exactly like Kat's family farm in Bavaria. "You're a farm girl," Sarah observed. "I can tell. City girls don't have calluses from milking." Kat burst into tears, not from fear, from being seen, from being understood as a person, not just an enemy prisoner. After processing, the women were assigned to barracks, long wooden buildings with rows of bunk beds, not luxurious but clean, warm. Wool blankets stacked on each bed. Real wool, not the thin synthetic stuff Germany had been producing since materials ran short. A small stove burned in the center of the room, keeping everything warm enough that breath didn't fog. Greta Elizabeth and Katharina were assigned bunks near each other. Fate or coincidence, it didn't matter. They stuck together because that's what people did in uncertain times. The three of them stood in the barracks looking around at this space that would be their prison. Elizabeth ran her hand over the clean blanket. Katerina sat on her bunk testing the mattress. Thin but there. Not just wooden boards. Helga Richter stood near the door, arms crossed, face skeptical. "They're fattening us up," she announced to the room, "like pigs before slaughter. Don't be fooled. This kindness is temporary." Greta wanted to believe her. It was safer to believe the worst, safer to expect cruelty. That way, if cruelty came, you were prepared. But the shrapnel wound on her shoulder, now properly cleaned and bandaged for the first time in months, told a different story. Night fell over Fort McCoy. The women tried to sleep, but sleep came in fragments. Too many emotions, too much confusion. This wasn't what they'd expected. This wasn't what they'd been told would happen. Every comfort felt like a trap. Every kindness felt like manipulation. Greta lay in her bunk, staring at the wooden ceiling, touching the iron cross pendant under her shirt. She thought about Klaus, her 16-year-old brother, alone in bombed-out Munich. She thought about her parents dead under rubble. She thought about all the soldiers she'd watched die, boys screaming for mothers who would never come. And she thought about the American nurse Sarah, who treated her shrapnel wound like it mattered, like Greta was worth saving. Elizabeth lay in the bunk below, writing in her hidden notebook by moonlight, documenting everything. The train, the arrival, the processing, Sarah's kindness, the warm barracks, all the details her father would have wanted recorded. Truth, even uncomfortable truth, especially uncomfortable truth. Katerina knelt beside her bunk and prayed the rosary 3 times through before climbing under her blanket. She prayed for her parents, for the farm, for her own soul. And though she felt guilty about it, she prayed a small thank you that she was here safe and warm instead of in the bombed cities she'd heard about. Morning came too soon, 6 o'clock. A bugle call, clear and musical, not harsh. The sound echoed across the camp. Women stirred, dressed in their worn uniforms. Tried to make themselves presentable. Failed mostly. 8 months of war and capture didn't wash off with cold water and hard soap. A guard knocked on the barracks door. Politely, actually knocked instead of just barging in. "Morning, ladies," he called through the door in accented German. "Breakfast in 20 minutes. Mess hall is the building with the American flag. You can't miss it." The women looked at each other. Breakfast. Real breakfast, not just hard bread and weak ersatz coffee. They'd been told there would be food, but believing it was different from experiencing it. They filed out into the cold morning. Frost covered everything, sparkling in weak sunlight. Breath fogged in the air. Other barracks emptied as German prisoners emerged and all heading in the same direction, following the smell that had started drifting across the camp. That smell, rich, savory, unmistakable. Meat cooking. Real meat. and something else. Something buttery and warm. Bread, maybe. Fresh bread, not the hard black rye that Germany had been surviving on for years. Greta, Elizabeth, and Katharina walked together, three women among dozens, all moving toward the mess hall like pilgrims toward a shrine. The smell grew stronger with every step. Katharina grabbed Elise's hand without thinking. Elise didn't pull away. 100 yards from the mess hall, they could see steam rising from vents in the roof. Heard voices inside. American soldiers laughing and talking. The casual sound of men eating breakfast without fear or hunger. 50 yards. The smell became overwhelming. Salt, smoke, fat, pepper, fresh baked goods, real coffee strong enough to smell from outside. Kat started crying without realizing it. 25 yards. They could see through the windows, long tables, metal trays, American soldiers sitting together eating, and the portions on their plates. Dear God, the portions. More food on one plate than many Germans saw in a week. At the door, the women hesitated. All of them. 52 women stopping at the threshold like they'd hit an invisible wall. Because this was the moment. This was where the truth would be revealed. Either the food was real or it wasn't. Either the Americans would feed them or they wouldn't. Either everything they'd been told was a lie or everything they'd experienced since capture was the lie. Greta took a deep breath, stepped forward, pushed open the door. Warmth hit them first. The mess hall was heated, actually heated, not just warmed by bodies and breath. Heat from radiators, heat from the kitchen. The temperature inside had to be 60 degrees at least. The women used to freezing nearly staggered from the shock of warmth. Then came the sight. The mess hall was huge. Wood beams overhead, American flags on the walls, long tables with benches, and at the far end a serving line. Industrial kitchen visible through a window. Cooks moving with practiced efficiency. Metal trays stacked. And on those trays, on every single tray that American soldiers carried past, was food. Real food, hot food. More food than should exist. And the smell. Dear God in heaven, the smell. It wasn't just cooking. It was abundance. It was safety. It was every good memory of home and family and peace wrapped into one overwhelming sensory experience that made women who'd survived bombs and starvation simply stop and weep. Sergeant James Anderson stood behind the serving counter, 32 years old from Tennessee, with his grandmother's kind eyes and his grandfather's farmer's hands. He'd volunteered for this duty, serving food to German prisoners. Some of the other soldiers thought he was crazy, but Anderson's grandfather had fought in the First War and come home saying something Anderson never forgot. The enemy's not the man across the trench. The enemy's the idea that put him there. You kill the idea, not the man, and you win forever. Anderson saw the German women standing frozen at the door, saw the tears, saw the disbelief. He'd seen this reaction before, but it never stopped affecting him. He nodded to them, smiled, not mockingly, genuinely. "Morning, ladies," he called out in careful German. "Grab a tray. Come on through. Breakfast's getting cold." Nobody moved. Anderson picked up a tray, held it up. "Like this, see? Just a tray. Nothing scary. Come on, I promise the food won't bite." Greta forced her legs to move. Someone had to go first. That's what leaders did. She walked to the counter, picked up a metal tray. It was warm from being stacked near the kitchen. She held it out like an offering. The first cook, a young man from Iowa, smiled at her. "How many eggs, ma'am?" She stared at him. Ma'am, he'd called her ma'am, like she was a person, like she deserved respect. How many?" she repeated in broken English. "Yeah, 2, 3. You look hungry. Let's say 3. He scooped 3 large spoonfuls of scrambled eggs onto her plate, yellow, fluffy, cooked in butter. Real butter, she could smell it. More eggs than she'd eaten in the last month combined. Next station, Anderson himself stood there with a skillet full of bacon, the source of that overwhelming smell. He picked up 4 strips with tongs and laid them carefully on her plate. Thick cut, perfectly cooked, still sizzling slightly. Greta's vision blurred with tears. "Bacon, Anderson said simply. "My grandmother's recipe. Hope you like it." Next station, toast, golden brown. "Butter's right there," the cook said, pointing to a metal container full of real butter. "Help yourself." She spread butter on the toast with shaking hands, watched it melt into the bread. This was madness. This couldn't be real. Last station. Coffee, strong, black. A American soldier poured her a full mug. Cream and sugar on the tables, he said. Fair warning, it's strong today. Greta carried her full tray to a table, sat down, stared at the food in front of her. Behind her, Elizabeth and Katerina were going through the same line, getting the same portions, the same abundance, the same impossible reality. All around them, other German women were sitting with full plates, some crying, some stunned into silence, some eating slowly reverently like they were in church, and this was communion. Greta picked up her fork, looked at the bacon, at these 4 perfect strips of meat that had been cooked with care and served with kindness to the enemy. She lifted one piece, brought it to her mouth, and bit down. The world ended and began again in that single taste. February came to Fort McCoy like a stranger bearing gifts nobody asked for. The snow fell softer, the wind cut less, daylight lingered 5 minutes longer each evening. Spring was still months away, but winter was loosening its grip, and with the thaw came something more dangerous than cold. Routine. Routine was comfortable. Routine was predictable. Routine let you forget you were a prisoner and start feeling almost human again. And that forgetting that small comfort made the truth even harder to face when it came. Greta woke each morning at 5:30, not because guards forced her, but because the hospital needed preparation before the first patients arrived. She'd wash in cold water from the basin dress in her worn uniform, now cleaner than it had been in months, thanks to Elizabeth's laundry expertise. She'd touch the Iron Cross pendant under her shirt, a ritual she couldn't quite abandon, even as its meaning dissolved. Then she'd walk across the frozen camp yard to the hospital, breath fogging in the pre-dawn darkness, arriving before Sarah to prove she could be trusted. The work became familiar, changing bandages, taking temperatures, administering medications according to precise American schedules. Everything documented, everything measured, everything done with a level of care that still shocked her 3 weeks into this new life. Friedrich's leg was healing. The pink tissue had filled in where infection had eaten toward bone. He'd walk with a limp, Sarah said, but he'd walk. He'd go home when the war ended, home to wherever home still existed. Each morning, Friedrich thanked them. Each morning, Greta felt the weight of that gratitude mixed with guilt, that Americans had saved what Germans had nearly destroyed. Bobby from Iowa had his cast removed. His arm was weak but whole. He showed Greta exercises to rebuild the muscle, demonstrating with the earnest enthusiasm of a farm boy who'd never learned to hate. He talked about Mary, his tractor-driving fiancée, about the spring planting he'd missed this year, about how his father was managing the farm alone and probably overdoing it because that's what fathers did. You'll go home soon too, Bobby told Greta one morning while she checked his arm strength. War's almost over. Everyone can see it. Then you get back to your brother, Klaus Wright, the hungry kid in Munich. Greta nodded throat tight. She'd received 2 more letters from Klaus, each one thinner than the last, both in paper and in hope. The handwriting grew shakier, the words more desperate. He was surviving barely on Allied charity as American forces pushed into Bavaria. Ironic that American soldiers were probably feeding Klaus the same rations they fed Greta, while Germans in between starved, according to the whims of a collapsing regime. Tell Klaus to hang in there, Bobby said. Tell him an Iowa farm boy said better days are coming. And hey, when you get home, you teach him what you learned here, about treating everybody decent regardless of who they are. That's how you make sure this never happens again. Simple wisdom from a simple man, but simple didn't mean wrong. Bobby understood something that took most people lifetimes to learn. Kindness wasn't weakness. It was the strongest thing there was. Elizabeth's days followed different patterns. The laundry room had become her classroom, though the teachers were newspapers instead of professors. Mrs. Henderson had figured out what Elizabeth was doing, reading every paper, collecting articles, building a library of truth in her hidden notebook. And rather than stop her, Mrs. Henderson started leaving the most important papers in obvious places. You read English better than most Americans, Mrs. Henderson said one afternoon during a break. They sat on wooden benches, hands raw from hot water and harsh soap, sharing coffee from a thermos Mrs. Henderson brought from home. Your father taught you right, the professor. Yes, Elizabeth answered carefully. He believed education required multiple perspectives, multiple languages. He said people who only read one language only understand half the world. Smart man, Mrs. Henderson sipped her coffee. What happened to him? The Gestapo arrested him, 1942, for speaking against the regime to his students. I never saw him again. Mrs. Henderson nodded slowly. My husband's cousin was in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, went to Spain in '36 to fight Franco, came home saying the same thing your father probably said, that fascism was poison, that it would spread if good people stayed silent. A lot of folks called him a communist, a troublemaker. Turned out he was just early to the truth. She refilled both their cups. The papers are reporting more camps every week. Soviet troops finding them in the East. It's bad, honey. Worse than what's being printed. I got a nephew in Patton's Third Army. He wrote me about a place called Ordruff. Said grown men cried when they saw what was there. Said Eisenhower himself came to witness it because he knew people would deny it later if there weren't American generals on record confirming the truth. Elizabeth felt cold that had nothing to do with February weather. How many camps? Nobody knows yet. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Work camps, death camps, places with gas chambers built like they were manufacturing death on assembly lines. Mrs. Henderson's voice was steady, but her hands shook slightly on her coffee cup. This is what your father died trying to stop. This is why he spoke up when speaking up meant death. He knew, and knowing meant he couldn't stay silent. He used to say, truth has weight, Elizabeth whispered, that once you know truth, you carry it forever. And the only way to lighten the load is to share it with others. Then you better get strong, Mrs. Henderson said gently, because you're going to be carrying heavy truth back to Germany. And a lot of people there won't want to hear it. They'll call it lies, propaganda. They'll say you were brainwashed by Americans. You ready for that? Elizabeth thought about her notebook, about every article carefully torn out and hidden, about the documentation she was building, evidence for a trial that hadn't happened yet, proof for people who would desperately want to disbelieve. I don't know if I'm ready, she admitted, but my father wasn't ready either. He spoke anyway. That's what courage is, speaking when you are terrified of the consequences. In the kitchen, Katerina was learning that America was bigger than she'd imagined. Not just geographically, though the maps Sergeant Anderson showed her were staggering in their scale, but bigger in possibility, in the variety of ways a person could live, in the freedom to choose your own path. Anderson had started teaching her English during slow periods between meals. Real English, not just military commands, conversational English, farm English, the language of people who worked with their hands and built lives from soil and stubbornness. How do you say Apfelstrudel in English? Kat asked one afternoon while preparing vegetables for dinner. Apfelstrudel. We stole the word from German, stole lots of words. Pizza from Italian, taco from Spanish. America's good at stealing the best parts of every culture and making them ours. He demonstrated proper knife technique for dicing onions. The key is a sharp knife and keeping your fingers curled back. Like this. See, fast, but safe. Kat copied his movements. Her hands had regained their strength over the past month. Farm hands, kitchen hands, hands that knew how to work. In my village, women cook like their mothers. Same recipes, same methods, same everything. Is it different here? Anderson grinned. In America, women do whatever they want. My sister runs a tractor repair shop in Knoxville. My cousin's wife is a lawyer. My grandmother, the one from Baden, she started her own bakery and ran it for 40 years. Made enough money to send all her kids to college. That's America. You want to farm like your mother, you can. Want to be a doctor, you can. Want to fly airplanes, you can. Freedom means choosing. Kat absorbed this slowly. The idea of women flying airplanes seemed absurd. Women were wives and mothers and maybe teachers if they didn't marry. That's what she'd always known. But here was Anderson talking about his sister repairing tractors like it was the most normal thing in the world. I think I only want to farm, she said quietly. Is that wrong if I could do anything but I choose simple life? Wrong, hell no, pardon my language. Anderson smiled. Farming's the most important work there is. You feed people, can't get more essential than that. My grandfather used to say farmers are the ones who keep civilization running. Politicians talk, soldiers fight, but farmers feed. Without farmers, everything else collapses. He showed her how to make cornbread, an American staple she'd never encountered. Cornmeal eggs, milk, a little sugar, baking powder. Simple ingredients producing something golden and wonderful. This is what my grandmother made when money was tight. Cheap, filling, delicious. Depression-era cooking, making something good from whatever you have. They worked in comfortable rhythm, teacher and student veteran and prisoner man and woman, all those labels mattering less than the shared work of feeding 200 people dinner. This was the danger of routine. It made you forget the labels. It made you see the person. Saturday night in late February brought something none of the prisoners expected. Entertainment. The camp commander announced it at dinner. A movie would be shown in the recreation hall. Optional attendance. An American film from the previous year, Meet Me in St. Louis, a musical about an American family. The women debated attending. Some refused on principle. Helga Richter was loudest in her refusal. American propaganda. They want to show us their perfect lives to make us feel inferior. But curiosity won over ideology for most. What was American entertainment like? How did they tell stories? What did they value enough to make permanent in film that evening? 42 of the 52 German prisoners filed into the recreation hall. Wooden chairs arranged in rows. A white sheet hung on the wall as a screen. American soldiers already seated munching popcorn, talking and laughing. They made room for the German women without hostility, just people watching a movie together. The projector started. Technicolor images flickered to life. Music swelled. And for the next 2 hours, the German women were transported into a world that felt like pure fantasy. The film showed an American family in St. Louis, Missouri at the turn of the century. The Smith family. Mother, father, 4 daughters, 1 son, a grandfather. They lived in a large house with electricity and indoor plumbing. They had conflicts that seemed impossibly trivial. Should they move to New York for father's job? Would the oldest daughter's beau propose? Would the World's Fair come to their city? Nobody was starving. Nobody was being bombed. Nobody lived in fear of secret police. The biggest crisis was a potential move to a different city and a sister's romantic troubles. But what struck the German women most wasn't the absence of tragedy. It was the presence of choice. The father considered his family's happiness when making career decisions. The mother spoke her mind freely. The daughters chose their own romantic interests. Even the youngest child, little Tootie, had opinions that adults actually listened to. This was democracy in miniature. Not voting booths and political parties, but the everyday practice of respecting individual will, of negotiating instead of commanding, of treating even children like people whose feelings mattered. When Judy Garland sang the trolley song, bouncing and joyful about meeting her beau on public transportation, Katharina's eyes glistened with fresh emotion. Not from sadness, from the overwhelming emotion of watching people live without fear. These fictional Americans from 40 years ago had more freedom, more joy, more simple human happinesses than real Germans had experienced in over a decade. Greta watched with clinical attention, analyzing, processing. The America on screen wasn't a military superpower. It was a place where normal people lived normal lives, where the biggest worries were social and personal, not political and existential, where happiness was possible without permission from the state. Elizabeth watched the technology. Technicolor, professional production, music recorded with full orchestras. This film probably cost more to make than most German families earned in lifetimes. American abundance extended even to entertainment. They could afford to spend lavishly on stories about nothing in particular because they had resources for both necessities and luxuries. The movie ended with the family staying in St. Louis together, happy watching fireworks at the World's Fair. Triumph through unity and love. Simple American optimism. The belief that things work out if you're decent to each other. The lights came up. American soldiers filed out, still chattering about their favorite scenes. The German women sat in stunned silence, some wiping tears, some staring at the blank screen like it might show them more of that impossible world. Walking back to the barracks, Greta spoke first. Did you notice the father when he announced they were moving to New York? The family objected, and he listened. He actually considered changing his career plans because his family didn't want to move. In Germany, father announces and family obeys, Elizabeth said. That's the natural order, or so we were taught. But their family seemed happier, healthier, more stable. Katerina was still crying softly. They were just happy, for no reason except being alive and together. When did we forget how to be happy like that? Helga Richter walked ahead of them, shoulders rigid with rejection. But even she had watched the entire film. Even she had seen what they'd all seen, a different way of living, a different set of values. And those values produced prosperous, happy people, while German values had produced rubble and death. That night, lying in her bunk, Greta couldn't sleep. The images from the film mixed with memories from before the war. Her own family had been happy once. Father reading by lamplight, mother humming while cooking, Klaus playing with wooden soldiers. Simple Munich domesticity. When had it changed? When had happiness become suspicious? When had the state demanded not just obedience but enthusiasm for its madness? She remembered Hitler youth meetings, the insistence on total loyalty, the denunciations of anyone who questioned, the gradual narrowing of acceptable thought until thinking itself became dangerous. It had happened slowly, each small step seeming reasonable in isolation, each compromise seeming necessary for the greater good, until suddenly they were a nation of people, too afraid to admit they were hungry, too indoctrinated, to question why their enemies ate better than they did, too committed to lies, to recognize truth when it tasted like bacon. In the bunk below, Elizabeth was writing in her notebook by moonlight, adding observations about the film, about American culture, about the gap between propaganda claims and witnessed reality. Documentation for a future she couldn't quite imagine, but knew was coming. Across the barracks, Katerina prayed her rosary, but tonight her prayers were different. Not begging for survival, not pleading for protection. Tonight she prayed thanks. Thanks for being alive. Thanks for full bellies. Thanks for the revelation that life could be lived without constant fear. And thanks, though it felt like betrayal to admit it, thanks for American kindness that had kept her alive to learn these lessons. In her corner, Helga Richter sat awake, staring at nothing. The movie had cracked something in her carefully maintained facade, because the American family on screen looked like families she remembered from before Hitler, before the madness, before Germany chose power over happiness. She'd served the regime faithfully, typed their orders, processed their paperwork, kept her head down and told herself she was just doing her job, just following orders, just surviving the only way she knew how. But surviving by serving evil was its own form of death. The death of conscience, the death of soul. And now these Americans, these enemies, were showing her what she'd traded away. Not through cruelty or punishment, but through simple acts of daily decency that highlighted how abnormal her normal had become. She pulled out a photograph she kept hidden. Herself and Rosa, schoolgirls maybe 14, arms around each other, laughing at some long forgotten joke. Rosa had been her best friend. Smart, kind, funny in ways that made Helga's sides hurt from laughing. Rosa had also been Jewish. Helga had typed Rosa's deportation order in 1942, had recognized the name, had hesitated for 1 second, then typed it anyway, because refusing meant joining Rosa on the train. And Helga wanted to live, so she typed, and Rosa went east, and Helga never saw her again. That was the weight Helga carried, the weight of choosing survival over friendship, of choosing silence over truth, of choosing comfort over courage. And every American kindness, every full meal, every warm barracks, every moment of decent treatment drove that weight deeper into her soul. She couldn't face it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. So she retreated further into denial, into anger, into bitter insistence that American kindness was manipulation, because accepting it as genuine kindness meant accepting her own complicity in genuine evil. Early May arrived with news that changed everything. The radio in the recreation hall always playing American music, and news crackled with an announcement that made every person in camp stop moving. Germany had surrendered. Unconditional surrender. May 8th, 1945. The war in Europe was over. The American soldiers erupted in celebration, cheering, hugging, some crying with relief. Letters could go home now saying the war was won. Boys could start thinking about going home. The killing was finished. The German prisoners reacted differently. Some collapsed. Some stood frozen. Some cried, though whether from relief or grief, nobody could say. The war was over. They'd lost. Everything they'd fought for, believed in, sacrifice for, had ended in total defeat. Greta stood in the hospital when she heard. Sarah was beside her, having just finished changing Friedrich's bandages. The radio announcement echoed through the building. Germany surrenders. Hitler dead. Berlin fallen. The Third Reich finished. Sarah looked at Greta with sympathy. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I know this is hard for you." Greta shook her head. Her cheeks remained wet throughout the entire conversation, but her voice was steady. "I'm not crying because we lost. I'm crying because the killing stopped. Because Klaus might actually survive now. Because no more boys will die for lies." She looked at Sarah directly. "We deserve to lose. We needed to lose. The only tragedy is how many had to die before we did." In the laundry room, Elizabeth heard the news and felt something like relief mixed with terror. Relief that the madness had ended. Terror of what came next. Germany was defeated, occupied, divided between victors. What would become of a nation built on lies once truth was mandatory? Mrs. Henderson found her sitting alone, staring at nothing. "You okay, honey?" "I don't know what I am," Elizabeth admitted. "My country is gone. Everything I knew is finished. I should feel sad, but mostly I feel relieved." "Is that wrong?" "Not wrong, human. You can love your country and hate what it became. You can mourn the loss and celebrate the end of evil. Complicated feelings for complicated times." In the kitchen, Katerina received the news while peeling potatoes. Sergeant Anderson turned off the radio and looked at her with concern. "Kat, you need a minute." She set down her peeler, wiped her hands on her apron, took a deep breath that shook with emotion. "My parents, if they survived, I can go home to them now. If the farm still stands, we can rebuild. If Germany can find peace, maybe we can find normal life again." "That's the spirit," Anderson said gently. "War's over. Now comes the hard part. Building something better from the ruins." That evening, the camp commander gathered all German prisoners in the recreation hall. American guards present, but relaxed. This wasn't a threat. This was information. The commander spoke through the translator. His words were clear and careful. "The war is over. You are still prisoners under international law, but your status is unchanged. You will continue to receive the same treatment, the same food, the same medical care. The Geneva Convention still applies. You are safe here." He paused, letting that sink in. "In the coming weeks, we'll begin repatriation planning. You'll go home when transport is arranged and conditions allow. Until then, life continues as it has." A hand raised. One of the older prisoners. "What about trials, war crimes? Will we be punished?" The commander's face grew serious. "You are prisoners of war, not war criminals. There's a difference. Some individuals will face justice for specific crimes, but being a soldier, being a clerk, being a nurse, those aren't crimes. You followed orders in a war your government started. That's not the same as committing atrocities." Relief rippled through the room. They wouldn't be executed, wouldn't be punished beyond imprisonment, would eventually go home. But the commander wasn't finished. "However, we will be conducting educational sessions about what happened during the war, about the camps, about the Holocaust, about the systematic murder of millions. You have the right to know the truth, and we have the obligation to tell it." Silence fell, heavy and complete. The truth. They were going to be shown the truth whether they wanted to see it or not. The sessions began the next week. Photographs, documents, testimony, maps showing the locations of hundreds of camps, statistics that made numbers meaningless because the human mind couldn't process millions of deaths, evidence so overwhelming that denial required willful blindness. Greta attended the first session and lasted 20 minutes before running outside to vomit. The medical experiments, the photographs of doctors, her profession conducting torture disguised as research. The oath she'd taken was to heal. But German doctors had used their knowledge to destroy, to degrade, to murder in the name of science. Sarah found her outside, retching into the snow. "I know, I'm sorry, it's horrible." "I'm a nurse," Greta gasped between heaves. I swore to heal, and my country turned medicine into murder. Not your country, the regime. There's a difference. Germany isn't the Nazi party. Germany is the people, and the people were lied to, used. Some people knew and helped. Some knew and stayed silent. Some never knew until now. You're in that last group, and what matters now is what you do with the knowledge. Elizabeth sat through the entire first session, took notes, documented every photograph, every testimony, every piece of evidence. Her face remained neutral, but her cheeks remained wet throughout the entire session. Afterwards, she went to the barracks and added everything to her hidden notebook. Mrs. Henderson had been right. Her father had died knowing this, had tried to warn people, had been killed for speaking truth. Now Elizabeth understood the weight he'd carried. The unbearable knowledge that your nation had become monstrous and speaking that truth meant death. She would speak it anyway. She would carry her father's truth and add her own testimony. She would go home to Germany and teach, and some would listen and some wouldn't, but she would speak because silence had enabled the horror. Never again would she choose silence. Katerina attended with Greta and Elizabeth. She made it through the photographs but broke during the testimony. A survivor, a Polish Jew speaking through tears about watching his children taken to gas chambers, about being forced to dig mass graves, about the smell of burning bodies that hung over the camps like fog. Katerina fled the room, ran to the chapel, fell on her knees before the altar, and prayed with an intensity that hurt, prayed for the souls of the murdered, prayed for forgiveness for all Germans who'd enabled it through action or inaction, prayed for the strength to face this truth and still believe in God's mercy. Sergeant Anderson found her there hours later, sat beside her in the pew, said nothing for a long time. Finally, quietly, my grandmother escaped this, came to America before it started. Her cousins stayed, whole family, 37 people. None survived. We found their names on the lists. Kat turned to him, face wet with grief and shame. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. We did this, my people. Not your people. The Nazis. There's a difference. My grandmother always said so. She said Germans weren't Nazis. Nazis were Germans who'd lost their souls. The people she left behind, her cousins, they were Germans. Good people, who got murdered by bad people who happened to be German too. He put a hand on her shoulder, gentle, respectful. You're not responsible for what happened, but you are responsible for what happens next. You go home carrying this knowledge. You teach it. You make sure the next generation knows. That's how you honor the dead, by making sure they didn't die for nothing. Helga Richter attended the sessions and sat in the back row with her arms crossed and her face hard. She watched the photographs, heard the testimony, saw the evidence. And with each new revelation, her denials grew louder in her own mind. Propaganda, faked photos, coached testimony. The Americans were lying to break German spirit. This couldn't be real, couldn't be true. Because if it was true, then everything she'd done, every order she'd typed, every name she'd processed made her complicit in mass murder. Rosa's face haunted her. Rosa laughing, Rosa studying, Rosa on that train looking back at the station with confused eyes, not understanding yet what was happening. The fourth session broke her. A map showing all the camps, hundreds of them, covering Poland, Germany, Austria-occupied territories. Each dot representing thousands of deaths, each location a factory of murder. The scale was incomprehensible. This wasn't isolated incidents. This was systematic, organized, industrial. Helga stood up in the middle of the presentation. Everyone turned to look. She opened her mouth to speak, to denounce it as lies, to defend the regime she'd served. But no words came because even she, desperate to disbelieve, couldn't deny this. Not with American soldiers as witnesses, not with photographs from their own cameras, not with testimony from their own troops who'd liberated the camps. She walked out, went to the barracks, sat on her bunk, and finally, after months of rigid denial, she broke. Greta found her there an hour later. Helga was holding the photograph of young Rosa, crying silently. Years of suppressed grief and guilt and horror finally escaping. I typed her name, Helga whispered. I knew it was her, my best friend, and I typed it anyway. Greta sat beside her, said nothing. Sometimes there were no words. Sometimes you just sat with someone in their hell and let them know they weren't alone. I can't take it back, Helga continued. Can't undo it. Can't bring her back. Can't change what I did. No, Greta agreed quietly. You can't. None of us can undo the past. But Klaus is alive because Americans chose kindness over revenge. Maybe Rosa would want you to honor her memory by choosing differently going forward, by teaching others to choose courage instead of comfort. Helga looked at her with eyes full of pain. Do I deserve forgiveness? I don't know. That's between you and God and Rosa's memory. But I know you deserve the chance to try to be better. We all do. That's what the Americans are giving us, not absolution, but opportunity. What we do with it determines who we become. The sessions continued through late May, each one harder than the last, each one stripping away another layer of comfortable lies. The German prisoners emerged transformed, not all in the same way. Some like Helga broke and had to rebuild from fragments. Some like Elizabeth had suspicions confirmed and resolve hardened. Some like Katharina had innocence destroyed and faith tested. Some like Greta had professions tainted and purposes clarified. But all of them, every single one, could no longer claim ignorance. The truth had been delivered, documented, proven beyond doubt. What they did with that truth would define the rest of their lives, and through ripples impossible to measure, help define their nation's future. The war was over. The killing had stopped. But the real work, the work of facing truth and building something better, was only beginning. And three women, three prisoners, who'd arrived expecting cruelty and found kindness instead, were preparing to carry that work home to a Germany that desperately needed it, but might not want to hear it. June arrived with surprising news. The camp commander called another assembly in the recreation hall. The women gathered expecting more education sessions. Instead, they heard something they'd never anticipated. Ladies, the commander began through the translator, the United States government is offering an option to some of you. Those who have lost immediate family in Germany, who have no home to return to, may apply for refugee status. You can stay in America, work, build new lives here. Eventually, if you choose, apply for citizenship. The hall erupted in confused murmurs. America was offering them a future. The enemy was offering them home. This is voluntary, the commander continued. Many of you have families waiting, parents, siblings, children. You will, of course, return to them. But for those who are alone, who face only ruins and uncertainty in Germany, America offers another path. Greta, Elizabeth, and Katharina sat together, processing, calculating. What did each of them have waiting back home? Greta had Klaus, 16 years old, starving in Munich. He needed her. That was simple. That was clear. But the thought crossed her mind. Could she bring him here? Apply for refugee status, then sponsor her brother give Klaus a life in America, where boys didn't starve and hatred wasn't taught in schools. Elizabeth had nothing. Father dead in Dachau, mother dead in the Dresden bombing. Her uncle was alive, her father's brother, but he'd written that he wanted to publish her father's hidden writings, to make sure the professor's truth survived. That was a mission. That was purpose. Could she abandon that to stay in safety while Germany needed truth-tellers? Katharina's choice was simplest. Her parents were alive. The farm still stood damaged, but standing. They needed her hands, her strength. There was no question. She would return. That evening, the three women sat on Greta's bunk talking in low voices. I could stay, Elizabeth said quietly. I could build a new life here, teach in American schools, let Germany deal with its own demons. But you won't, Greta said. It wasn't a question. No, I won't, because my father died speaking truth, and if I stay here in comfort while Germany rebuilds on lies, his death meant nothing. Elizabeth's voice was firm. I have to go back, even knowing it will be hard, especially knowing it will be hard. Katharina took both their hands. My parents are waiting. I have no choice. But I'm scared. Everything I learned here about freedom, about kindness, about treating people as people, how do I bring that to a place that's forgotten all of it? You plant it like seeds, Greta said, echoing Anderson's grandfather's words. You plant truth in ruined soil, and you wait for it to grow. She paused, touched the Iron Cross pendant one last time. then pulled it off her neck, held it in her palm. This symbol of the old Germany, the Germany of lies and hatred and pride that destroyed everything it touched. She walked to the small stove in the center of the barracks, opened the door, dropped the pendant into the flames. Klaus needs me, she said, watching the metal heat and warp. But more than that, Klaus needs a sister who can teach him truth, who can show him another way. I can't do that from America. I have to go home. We all do. Elizabeth and Katharina nodded. It was decided. The next morning, they informed the commander. They were returning to Germany, all three of them, along with most of the other prisoners. Out of 52 women, only 4 chose to stay. 4 who truly had nothing and no one left. The women who chose to stay looked at them with something like envy mixed with fear. Staying was safe. Returning was brave. Or maybe returning was foolish and staying was wise. Nobody could say for certain. Preparations began. Medical examinations, updated paperwork, travel arrangements. The women would depart in late July, transported by ship to European ports, then distributed to their home regions by rail. The final weeks at Fort McCoy took on a bittersweet quality. Every meal in the mess hall felt precious now. Every conversation with American staff felt like saying goodbye before the goodbye actually came. The women were leaving the strange safety of captivity to return to the uncertainty of freedom in a defeated nation. Sergeant Anderson pulled Greta aside one afternoon in the kitchen. I got something for you, for Klaus. He handed her a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a medical textbook, English and German parallel text, basic field medicine, and tucked inside a letter of recommendation. To whom it may concern, Anderson had written in careful English. Margaret Schneider served with distinction as a medical assistant at Fort McCoy POW camp. She demonstrated exceptional skill, compassion, and dedication to healing. I recommend her without reservation for any medical position. Signed, Staff Sergeant James Anderson, United States Army. Greta's fingers trembled against the envelope. Why do this for me? Because Klaus is going to need medical care, and you're going to need work. And maybe, just maybe, having an American reference will help you get a job where you can do some good. Anderson smiled. Plus, there's a package of seeds in there. American vegetables. Plant them in Klaus's honor. Grow something good from American soil and German dirt. She hugged him, actually hugged him, this man who'd fed her when she was the enemy, who'd treated her like a person when she'd been trained to see him as a monster. Thank you, she whispered, for everything, for the bacon, for the kindness, for showing me what my country forgot. Sarah Mitchell gave Elizabeth a similar package. Books, American history, the Constitution, democracy explained in clear, simple language. For when you teach, Sarah said, show them what freedom looks like on paper so they can build it in practice. Mrs. Henderson gave Elizabeth something else, the name and address of her nephew in Patton's Third Army. He's going to be stationed in Germany during occupation. If you need help, if you run into trouble speaking truth, you write to him. He'll make sure you're protected. Freedom of speech isn't just for Americans. It's for anyone brave enough to use it. Anderson gave Katharina the American cookbook they'd been building together. All the recipes they'd shared. American biscuits, Bavarian Apfelstrudel, cornbread, spätzle, a culinary bridge between two worlds. Feed people, Anderson told her. Feed them well. Feed them the truth along with the food. Make your farm a place where people come not just for bread, but for hope. He also gave her something unexpected, his address in Tennessee, and a photograph of himself standing in his grandmother's old bakery, the one she'd built after coming from Baden. On the bite, in his careful handwriting, from Germany to America to Germany again, the circle of kindness, never forget. The night before departure, the 52 women gathered in the barracks one last time. Some were leaving for America tomorrow. Most were leaving for Germany. All were leaving Fort McCoy, the strange place that had been prison and school and salvation all at once. Helga Richter stood up. The woman who'd been so hard, so angry, so insistent that American kindness was manipulation. She looked at the group with a different eyes now. Softer eyes. Broken but rebuilding eyes. I was wrong, she said simply. About everything. About Americans. About kindness. About what courage looks like. She paused. I go home to tell young people about Rosa, about what happens when good people stay silent, about the cost of choosing safety over truth. I don't know if I can ever forgive myself, but maybe I can teach others not to make my mistakes. The room was silent. Then one by one, women began speaking, sharing what they'd learned, what they planned to do with the knowledge. Aniko, 19, the girl who'd hyperventilated during breakfast. I want to teach children, teach them to question, to think, to never blindly follow. Maria, 35. I want to help rebuild, not just buildings, people, souls, the parts of Germany that got destroyed before the bombs ever fell. One by one they spoke. 52 women transformed by bacon and truth planning to carry both home. The departure morning arrived gray and cool. July 23rd, 1945. 6 months almost to the day since they had arrived. Buses waited outside the camp gates. Beyond them, the road to Chicago. Beyond that, ships to Europe. Beyond that, home, or what was left of it. The women assembled with their small bags. They owned almost nothing, but they carried something weightless and infinitely heavy. Truth, the burden and gift America had given them. Greta stood with Elizabeth and Katerina, 3 women who'd arrived as strangers and were leaving as sisters. They'd made promises to each other, to write, to stay connected, to support each other as they did the impossible work of teaching truth in a nation that desperately wanted to forget. Sarah Mitchell came to say goodbye to Greta. "You're going to be fine," she said. "You're strong. Klaus is lucky to have you." "I'm lucky to have had you," Greta replied. "You showed me what nursing should be, what humanity should be. I won't forget." Mrs. Henderson squeezed Elizabeth's shoulder. "Your father would be proud. Speak his truth. Speak your truth. Don't let anyone silence you." "I won't," Elizabeth promised. "Never again." Anderson walked with Katharina to the bus. They stood awkwardly for a moment, 2 people who become friends across an impossible divide. Finally, Kat spoke. "In another world and another time." "I know," Anderson said gently. "But in this world, in this time, you go home to your parents and I go home to Tennessee. And maybe that's how it should be. We're not meant to be together. We're meant to carry forward what we learned together." He took her hand, pressed something into it, a small American flag pin, the same one he'd given Greta, not as a symbol of conquest, as a reminder. Values matter more than borders. Truth matters more than pride. And kindness, even to enemies. That's what makes a nation great. Katerina clutched the pin. "I'll never forget you. Any of you. What you did for us." "We didn't do anything special," Anderson said. "We just treated you like people. That's the minimum. The tragedy is that your government taught you to expect less." The buses loaded, women climbing aboard, finding seats, looking back at Fort McCoy one last time. The camp that had been their prison and their salvation. The place where they'd tasted freedom in a breakfast they'd never forget. As Greta's bus pulled away, she watched Anderson and Sarah and Mrs. Henderson growing smaller in the distance. Americans, people she'd been taught to hate, people who'd saved her life by showing her how to live differently. The bus convoy rolled through Wisconsin countryside. Green now, summer, growing things, American farms prosperous and peaceful, women working in fields, children playing, life without fear. On the ship crossing the Atlantic, the 3 women stood together on deck. 10 days at sea, 10 days to prepare for what waited on the other side. The ocean was calmer than when they'd crossed as prisoners. The ship was cleaner. The food was adequate. The American crew was respectful. Everything about the journey home was better than the journey to captivity had been, except the knowledge of what they were returning to. Other German prisoners stood along the railings staring east toward Europe, some excited to return, some terrified, most somewhere in between. One evening as the sun set over the Atlantic, Elizabeth read from her notebook. 6 months of observations, proof that she hadn't imagined it. America had really been that way, kind, abundant, free. "What will we tell them?" Katerina asked. "Who will believe us?" "Some will," Greta said. "Not everyone, but some. And we'll teach those who listen, and they'll teach others, and slowly maybe truth will take root." "My father used to say truth is like water," Elizabeth added. "It seeps into cracks. It finds a way. You can dam it temporarily, but eventually it breaks through. As the European coastline appeared through morning mists, the women's hearts grew heavy. They were home, changed forever, carrying truth back to a land built on lies. It would be the hardest thing they had ever done. The ship docked in a British-occupied zone. The women disembarked, processed through Allied checkpoints, sorted by destination. Germany was divided now. American zone, British zone, French zone, Soviet zone. The country carved up like a carcass. Greta was assigned transport to Munich, American zone. Elizabeth to Berlin, Soviet zone the most dangerous. Katerina to Bavaria, American zone. This was where they separated. Write to me, Greta said, hugging them both. Tell me you're alive. Tell me you're teaching. Tell me it's working. Every month, Elizabeth promised, we stay connected. We're stronger together. We survived lies with truth, Katerina whispered. Now we survive truth with courage. They separated, 3 women going to 3 different Germanys, each carrying the same mission, each terrified, each determined. Greta's train to Munich crawled through devastated landscape, cities reduced to rubble, people thin and haunted. Everywhere the smell of death and dust and despair. This was what her Germany had become. She found Klaus in the basement of St. Michael's Church, exactly where his last letter had said he'd be. Father Johannes had been sheltering orphans there, 12 children, sharing one blanket, eating whatever the Americans gave them. Klaus was sitting on a broken pew staring at nothing. 16 years old but looking ancient, thin, filthy, hollow-eyed. Greta stood in the doorway, watched him for a long moment. Her baby brother, the boy who used to steal butter and play with wooden soldiers. Now this. Klaus, she said softly. He turned, looked at her, didn't recognize her at first. Then his eyes widened. Greta? He stood up slowly like movement hurt, stared at her. You're fat. I mean, you look fed. That's what broke her. The shock in his voice, that his sister looked healthy. She rushed to him, hugged him, felt his bones through his shirt, felt him shaking. I'm here, I'm home, I'm going to take care of you. They said prisoners starve, Klaus whispered. How are you? I'll explain everything, Greta promised. But first we eat. She'd saved her American rations from the ship. Chocolate, crackers, canned meat. She spread them out. Klaus stared like they were hallucinations. Is this real? It's real. Eat slowly. Your stomach isn't used to it. Klaus ate, cried while eating. Where did this come from? America. The Americans fed me, every day, 3 meals, real food, as much as I wanted. Klaus looked at her like she'd grown a second head. But the Americans are supposed to, they were supposed to. I know what we were told, Greta said gently. It was all lies, Klaus, everything. The Americans treated me better than our own government ever did. And I'm going to tell you everything about bacon and kindness and truth. But first you need to regain your strength. Over the following days, Greta found them a room in a partially intact building. Got work at a makeshift hospital run by American medical staff. Her letter of recommendation from Anderson helped. The Americans hired her immediately, gave her medical supplies, paid her an occupation currency that could buy real food. She fed Klaus, slowly, carefully, watching his body remember how to process nutrition. And as he grew stronger, she told him stories about Fort McCoy, about Sarah and Anderson and Mrs. Henderson, about 3 German women learning that enemies could be teachers, about biscuits and gravy and the taste of truth. Klaus listened with eyes that grew wider every day. But why would they be kind to prisoners? Because that's who they are, Greta explained. They believe every person has worth, even enemies, especially enemies. Because how you treat people when you have power over them, that's who you really are. She showed him the cookbook Anderson had given her. I'm going to teach you to make American biscuits, and while we cook, I'm going to teach you English. And while you learn, I'm going to teach you to think for yourself, to question, to never blindly follow, because that's how we make sure this never happens again. In Berlin, Elizabeth found devastation beyond imagination. The city was ruins, Soviet soldiers everywhere, fear thick as smoke. But she also found her uncle and her father's hidden notebooks. They worked in secret at first, typing her father's writings, adding Elizabeth's own testimony, creating a manuscript that told the truth about the Nazi regime, about American captivity, about the camps, about everything. It was dangerous work. The Soviets didn't want free thinking any more than the Nazis had, but Elizabeth was careful. She used her father's codes. She distributed pages slowly. She taught in basements, in back rooms, and anywhere people gathered who wanted to hear truth. Young people came, teenagers who'd grown up under Hitler and wanted to understand what had happened. Elizabeth taught them about democracy, about free press, about the American Constitution, about values that put people over power. "Your father died for this," one student said after a particularly intense session. "How do we honor that?" "By living differently," Elizabeth answered, "by thinking critically, by speaking truth even when it's dangerous, by building a Germany he would have been proud of." In Bavaria, Katerina returned to her family's farm. Her parents wept when they saw her. Healthy, safe, alive. The farm was damaged but salvageable. And Kat brought gifts, American seeds, corn, beans, tomatoes, vegetables that didn't grow in Bavaria before. She planted them with her father, taught him American techniques Anderson had shared. The farm began producing again. But more than vegetables grew. Kat's kitchen became a gathering place. Neighbors came for food and stayed for stories. She told them about America, about the movies she'd watched, about freedom and choice and treating even children like their opinions mattered. She taught them to make American biscuits. And while they cooked together, she talked about values, about kindness over cruelty, about truth over pride, about building something better from the ruins. Some people called her crazy. Some said she'd been brainwashed. But some listened. And those who listened began to change. And those who changed began to teach others. The months turned to years: 1946, 47, 48, 49, 1950. Germany slowly rebuilt, not all at once, not all in the same direction. The division between East and West hardened. Democracy in the West, communism in the East. Greta worked in Munich's rebuilding hospital. Klaus grew strong, learned English, got a scholarship to study medicine at the University of Munich. American sponsorship arranged through contacts Greta had maintained. Klaus would become a doctor, would carry forward his sister's commitment to healing. Elizabeth published her father's writings underground in East Berlin. Risky work, dangerous work, but necessary work. In 1949, just before the Berlin Wall began to form, she escaped to West Berlin, continued teaching, became a university professor, taught political theory the way her father had, with truth and courage and no apologies. Katharina's farm became a model for the region. Productive, prosperous, a place where old farming wisdom mixed with new American techniques. She married a local man who'd also survived the war. They had 3 children, taught them about kindness and truth from the beginning. The 3 women wrote to each other monthly, shared their struggles and victories, supported each other across the divided Germany, kept each other honest, kept each other brave. And they never forgot Fort McCoy, never forgot bacon and kindness and American values that had saved them not by conquest, but by example. 1965 arrived, 20 years since the war ended. Fort McCoy announced a reunion, former prisoners and former guards, a celebration of peace, an acknowledgement of the bonds formed in that strange time when enemies became teachers. Greta received the invitation. By then, she was head nurse at Munich General Hospital. Klaus was a doctor there too, both of them respected, both of them known for treating every patient with dignity, both of them teaching younger staff that healing has no borders. Elizabeth received the invitation in West Berlin. By then, she was a renowned professor, author of several books on democracy and freedom. Her father's writings had been published legally in the West. Truth preserved, legacy honored. Katerina received the invitation on her prosperous farm. By then, she had grandchildren. The American vegetables had crossbred with Bavarian varieties, creating new strains more productive than either alone. Her kitchen still fed neighbors, still taught values along with recipes. All 3 decided to attend. This would be their first time back in America since 1945. Their first time seeing the people who'd changed their lives. Their first chance to say thank you properly. The journey back felt like traveling through time. Flying now, not crawling by ship. The Atlantic crossed in hours instead of days, landing in Chicago, then driving to Wisconsin. The landscape still green, still prosperous, still peaceful. Fort McCoy looked different. No longer a POW camp, a training facility now. But some buildings remained, including the old mess hall. The reunion was held there, in the exact room where they'd first tasted bacon and truth. Greta walked in and saw Sergeant Anderson immediately. He was 52 now, gray in his hair, lines around his eyes, but the same kind expression, the same farmer's hands. "Greta," he said, smiling, "my God, you made it." "We made it," she corrected. She turned and gestured. Klaus stood behind her, 36 years old now, strong, healthy, confident. "This is Klaus, my brother, the hungry boy in Munich, who became a doctor because you showed me what kindness looks like." Anderson shook Klaus's hand. "Your sister saved you by learning how to save others. I just fed her breakfast." "You did more than that," Klaus said in perfect English. "You taught her that enemies are only enemies until someone chooses to be human first. She taught me. I teach my patients. Your kindness ripples forward." Elizabeth arrived and found Mrs. Henderson, 75 now, retired, but still sharp, still strong. "You published your father's work," Mrs. Henderson said. It wasn't a question. She'd been following Elizabeth's career through newspapers. "I did. Truth won, eventually, like you said it would. Not won, never wins completely, but it endures. That's enough." Katharina found Sarah Mitchell, 49 now, still nursing, still compassionate. They hugged like old friends because that's what they were. "I teach my grandchildren about you," Kat said, "about the American nurse who saw me as a person when I couldn't see myself that way, about kindness that crosses borders. And I tell my students about the German prisoners who taught me that healing has no nationality," Sarah replied. We learned from each other. The reunion dinner was served in the mess hall, and on the menu, deliberately symbolically, was the meal that had changed everything. Biscuits and gravy. The three women sat together at the same table where they'd sat 20 years earlier. Anderson served them personally just as he had then, placed 4 strips of bacon on each plate, smiled the same genuine smile. Greta picked up her fork, looked at the bacon, remembered that first bite. The moment everything changed, she tasted it again. 20 years later, it was still good, perfectly cooked. But now she knew why. Now she understood what it represented. American values, the values that had fed enemies and taught them truth and sent them home to rebuild. The values that had won not through force, but through example. After dinner, there were speeches. The camp commander, now retired, spoke about reconciliation, about the importance of treating even enemies with dignity, about how Fort McCoy had been a laboratory for peace. Then Anderson stood up, raised his glass. "To the German women who came here as prisoners and left as teachers, who carried truth back to a land that needed it, who proved that kindness is stronger than hatred, who showed us that the enemy isn't the person, it's the idea. And ideas change when you feed people well and tell them the truth." Everyone drank, Americans and Germans, together, former enemies, current friends, proof that people could change, that nations could change, that the future didn't have to repeat the past. Greta stood to respond. Her English was fluent now. 20 years of teaching, Klaus had perfected it. "Sergeant Anderson, you say we taught you, but you taught us first. You taught us that America's strength isn't its military, it's its values. The belief that every person matters, that truth prevails, that kindness changes hearts. Klaus is alive because of those values. Elizabeth teaches because of those values. Katharina feeds people because of those values. And we've taught hundreds, maybe thousands, to live by those values too. Your bacon saved our bodies. Your kindness saved our souls. And your truth saved our country. Thank you for everything." The room erupted in applause, people wiping tears, because everyone in that room understood something profound. They'd witnessed proof that enemies could become friends, that wars could end in reconciliation, that the cycle of hatred could break. Later that evening, as the sun set over Fort McCoy, The three women stood outside the mess hall, the same place they'd stood 20 years earlier, smelling bacon for the first time, not believing it could be real. "We did it," Katerina said softly. "We survived. We taught. We changed things." "Not enough," Elizabeth said. "Germany is still divided, still struggling, still dealing with our past." "But better than if we'd stayed silent," Greta added. "Better than if we'd chosen comfort over truth." They stood in silence for a moment. Three old friends, three teachers of truth. Three women who'd been transformed by the simple act of being treated with unexpected kindness. "The bacon was just bacon," Elizabeth mused. "The real gift was what it represented, the proof that we'd been lied to. That opened the door to questioning everything else." "And once you start questioning," Greta said, "you can't stop. That's the danger to tyrants. That's the power of freedom. One question leads to another." "So we keep asking," Katerina concluded. "We keep teaching others to ask. We keep planting seeds of truth and waiting for them to grow." They returned to Germany the next day, back to their separate lives, but connected by shared experience and shared mission. They would continue teaching, continue speaking truth, continue honoring the gift America had given them. Not the gift of food, though the food had been good. Not the gift of safety, though the safety had been real. The gift of an example, of a nation that chose values over revenge, of people who treated enemies as future friends, of a country that believed in human dignity enough to practice it even when it wasn't required. That was the gift, and they would spend the rest of their lives passing it forward. Now listen, I'm talking to you, the person reading this story. Maybe you're 65, maybe 70, maybe you remember the world these women lived in. Maybe you served in that war. Maybe your father did. Maybe you remember when America chose to rebuild its enemies instead of destroying them. This story matters because it reminds us who we are, who we were, who we can be again. America's greatest weapon has never been our bombs or our guns or our military might. It's been our values, the values that made us feed our prisoners the same food we ate, the values that made us treat captives with dignity, the values that made us rebuild our enemies instead of grinding them into the dirt. That's not weakness, that's strength. The kind of strength that lasts generations, the kind of strength that changes minds and hearts and futures. Greta, Elizabeth, and Katharina didn't become Americans. They became believers. Believers that freedom works, that democracy matters, that truth prevails, that kindness changes the world more effectively than cruelty ever could. They went back to Germany and taught those values. And their students taught others. And those others taught more. And slowly, painfully, Germany rebuilt itself into a democracy, into an ally, into a partner. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because people like Anderson and Sarah and Mrs. Henderson chose to see the humanity in their enemies. Because they chose to feed them well and tell them the truth and treat them like people who mattered. And it worked. Not perfectly, not completely, but it worked better than hatred would have, better than revenge, better than dehumanization. Today, when we debate who we are as a nation, remember this. The America that fed German prisoners biscuits and gravy in 1945 is the same America that rebuilt Europe. The same America that faced down the Soviets without firing a shot. The same America that proved our way of life, our values aren't just American. They're universal. They're what humans naturally choose when given the chance. Three women learned that truth over breakfast. They carried it home. They taught it to others. And through them, through their teaching, through their courage, American values help transform a nation. That's the America worth remembering. The America worth being. The America that wins not by destroying enemies, but by showing them a better way. So the next time someone tells you American values are weak, remember Greta and Klaus healing patients together. Remember Elizabeth teaching democracy in dangerous places. Remember Katharina feeding neighbors and teaching kindness. Remember that bacon and truth and kindness change the world, and they can do it again. That's who we are. That's who we've always been. And that's who we must never stop being. The taste of truth lasts forever. American values change the world. One breakfast at a time. Share this story. Tell it to your grandchildren. Make sure the next generation knows. Because the greatest generation wasn't just the one that won the war. It was the one that won the peace, the one that chose values over vengeance, the one that understood the enemy wasn't the person, it was the idea. And you kill ideas with better ideas. You defeat hatred with kindness. You win forever by treating enemies like future friends. That's America. That's our legacy. That's what makes us great. Not our power, our principles, not our might, our mercy, not our weapons, our values. Never forget it. Never abandon it. Never let anyone tell you that kindness is weakness. Because 3 German women learned the truth. And they spent their lives proving it. And the world is better because they did. The bacon was real. The kindness was real. The transformation was real. And the lesson endures. America at its best doesn't just defeat enemies, it makes them allies, not through force, through example, through values lived out loud, through the simple revolutionary act of treating all people with dignity. That's the story. That's the truth. That's who we are. Remember it, honor it, live it, because the world is watching. And they need to see that America, the real America, the America of values and principles and kindness and truth is still here. Still strong, still willing to feed enemies bacon and teach them freedom and send them home to build something better. That's how you change the world. One meal, one truth, one act of unexpected kindness at a time.